Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Although it's not as widely heard as it once was, the informal language known as Cockney Rhyming Slang is still widely regarded to be one of London's most famous quirks, and it remains an intrinsic aspect of the city's character. In this video, I'll be explaining how the language works by showing you 26 examples, one for each letter of the alphabet. I'll even throw in a bit of history for you too. Cockney rhyming slang is believed to have developed from an older form of jargon known as flash, which was developed by London's criminals as a secret method of communication. Its use was widespread in the early 19th century, particularly amongst the many thousands of convicts who ended up being transported to Australia. Examples of flash include bit faker, which meant someone who forges coins, and swished, which meant married. Cockney rhyming slang, meanwhile, appears to have come on the scene around the mid-19th century in London's East End. At the time, this was an area blighted by immense poverty, where many folk had to, shall we say, bend the rules somewhat in order to survive. It was in this environment, amongst dodgy market traders and petty crooks, that rhyming slang evolved, its use being very similar to flash in that it helped disguise conversations whenever strangers or police constables lurked nearby. So then, how do you speak Cockney? Well, most Cockney rhyming slang terms are formed by pairs of words, with the second word providing the rhyme. Here's an example: donkey's ears, which translates as years. When dealing with such two-word terms, the real trick is to omit the second word. So in this case, you'd simply say donkeys. An example of this term in its shortened version, therefore, would be, blimey, I haven't seen you in donkeys, mate. Other terms are formed by three words, most of which have and in the middle as a conjunction. A good example of a three-word term would be bees and honey, which means money. Or tit for tat, which means hat. When using three-word terms, it's generally acceptable, in my opinion anyway, to use the whole phrase as they tend to roll off the tongue better. Having said that, you will find many Cockney speakers will still opt to leave out the rhyming word, and in some cases they'll do this whilst maintaining the middle part of the phrase. Still with me? So bees and honey would become bees and. For example, I'm running a bit low on the old bees and at the moment. Or in the case of tit for tat, that's a lovely tit for you wearing. Occasionally, you may also come across a rhyming slang term which consists of just one word. For example, Sherlock Holmes's arch-nemesis, Moriarty, can be used to mean party, as in, that was a great Moriarty last night. I'd now like to take you through a basic Cockney rhyming slang alphabet, with an example and brief explanation for each letter. In each case, I'll give you a few seconds to try and guess what the words and phrases mean before revealing the answer. Hopefully it will give you a good feel for how this cheeky language works. This selection will only scratch the surface, of course. There are hundreds of terms out there to discover, because despite what some purists may say, Cockney rhyming slang has evolved and been added to over the years, just like any other language. A is for Aristotle, which means bottle. I could have gone for apples and pears here, but that's by far the most famous example of Cockney rhyming slang, and I'm sure you already knew that one, didn't you? Aristotle is one of those rare instances in which a Cockney rhyming slang phrase consists of just one word. An example of its use would be, waiter, another Aristotle of this fine red, please. B is for Bo Peep, which means sleep. As well as rhyming with sleep, this term alludes to being in a state of slumber even further when you consider that Bo Peep is a shepherdess, and that counting sheep is a traditional method for trying to make yourself doze off. There's quite a specific way to use bo peep. You say that you're going to call for bo, as in, it's getting late, time to call for bo. C is for cock and hen, which means 10, usually when referring to money. A derivative of cock and hen is cockle, which specifically refers to a £10 note. An example of its use would be, my wallet's looking a bit empty, I'm down to my last cockle. D is for dustbin lids, which means kids. An example of its use would be, can you please ask your dustbins to keep the noise down? E is for elephant's trunk, which means drunk. A fair amount of Cockney rhyming slang refers to alcohol and the state of being tipsy. Other ruder phrases which describe the state of being drunk include Rhymes and List and Oliver Twist. I'm sure you can guess what they both rhyme with. In a similar way to bo peep, elephant's trunk is enhanced further by the fact that seeing pink elephants is a euphemism for being intoxicated. A way of using this phrase? Oh, I don't feel too good this morning. I was elephants last night. F is for frog and toad, which means road. An example, blimey, this frog's a bit busy, isn't it? If you want a more modern twist on frog and toad, you can instead say Kermit, which of course refers to Stardom's most famous frog. An example of that would be, I'm just popping down to Kermit. G is for giraffe, which means laugh. Giraffe's often used in an accusatory tone as a way of asking whether or not someone's being serious. I.e., oi, you having a giraffe, mate? A more traditional way of saying laugh in Cockney rhyming slang is to use the phrase Turkish Bath. So in that case you'd say, you having a Turkish, mate? H is for Hampstead Heath, which means teeth. This is one of several rhyming slang terms which are inspired by a specific area of London. Another example would be Barnet Fair, which means hair. Interestingly, Cockneys used to refer to teeth as Hounslow Heath, which is another area, this time towards the west of London. The switch to Hampstead appears to have occurred at some point in the early 20th century. When using this phrase, it's acceptable to pluralise the word Hampstead. So you'd say something like, I'm off to the dentist now to get my Hampsteads checked. I is for ice cream freezer, which means geyser. No, I'm not talking about those vents in the earth which shoot out boiling hot water. Geyser in this context is an informal term for a man and has been a popular phrase both in London and other parts of the UK for many years. Other Cockney terms for geyser include Julius Caesar and lemon squeezer. Depending on the adjective used, geyser can be good or bad. Calling someone a diamond geezer, for instance, is a big compliment, whilst a dodgy geezer is someone best avoided. An example? Be careful, that ice cream's a bit naughty. J is for jockey's whips, which means chips. This phrase only really works in its intended context if you're in the UK, because elsewhere chips are called fries, aren't they? I wonder what the rhyming slang for fries would be. Wise guys, maybe? Anyway, in Britain, jockey's whips are best paired with a nice bit of Lillian Gish, which means fish. It's worth taking a quick detour here to look a bit further at Lillian Gish, as it's an interesting term which demonstrates how a lot of rhyming slang has been influenced by celebrities over the years. You see, Lillian Gish was an early American film star. Her career began in around 1912, and although few will be aware of her today, she would have been a big name in the first half of the 20th century, certainly famous enough to inspire Cockney dialect. Ruby Murray, which means curry, is another example. Ruby was a famous singer who first rose to prominence in the 1950s. This was about the same time that Indian restaurants were becoming mainstream in the UK, so to Cockneys the pair went hand in hand. In more recent years, Britney Spears has given us beers, and Danny Glover has given us lover. So, back to jockey's whips. An example of its use would be, I like to pour salt and vinegar all over me jockeys. K is for King Lear's, which means ears. Like Hampstead Heath, this is a good example of how a phrase which refers to a single entity can be pluralised. It's also one of those rare examples where, despite being a two-word Cockney rhyming phrase, it's acceptable to say both words rather than shortening the term. An example of its use would be, sorry, I can't hear you. I reckon I need to get my King Lear syringed. In London, a very old slang term for ears is lug holes, which has been in use since the 16th century. The Cockneys have got a rhyming slang term for this too, Toby jugs, or lugs. L is for lollipop, which means shop. It can also be used to describe chops, as in pork chops, lamb chops, and so on. In terms of a shop, though, you could use lollipop to say, I'm popping down the lollipop. Do you need anything? M is for Mother Hubbard, which means cupboard. As with Bo Peep, this term alludes to a nursery rhyme, the subject matter of which is connected to the term. An example, the old mother's looking a bit bare. N is for nuclear sub, which means pub. This is a modern and no doubt controversial modern twist on the much older and still popular term battle cruiser, which means boozer. Boozer itself being another slang term for pub. An even older Cockney rhyming slang phrase for pub is rubber dub. Anyway, if you're feeling brave enough to use this newfangled modern version, you could say something like, do you fancy a pint down the nuclear? O is for Oxo Cube, which means tube, as in the London Underground. When the London Underground first opened way back in 1863, trains were pulled by steam engines, and as such the tunnels in which they ran were relatively shallow, as they had to allow for ventilation points. It wasn't until 1890, following new tunnelling techniques and the development of electric traction, that London received its first truly deep level line. That was the City and South London Railway, which now forms part of the Northern Line. Being round and relatively narrow, these new deep level lines quickly came to be nicknamed the Tube. Then, in 1910, Oxo stock cubes were first introduced, so it's not surprising that Cockneys quickly found a way of linking these two marvels of the modern world together. An example of OXO cube would be, sorry I'm late, there were delays on the OXO again. P is for polo mint, which means skint. Skint is a slang term in its own right. It means to be poor or broke. It's most likely derived from the old sailor's term skinned, which meant to be robbed of your clothes and money, usually whilst you were blind drunk. The Cockney Rhyming Slang term polo mint is relatively recent, as the sweets weren't introduced in Britain until 1948. They're similar to American lifesavers. The much more traditional way to say skint in Cockney Rhyming Slang is to use the term brassic lint. In the late 19th and early 20th century, a brassic lint was a popular type of medical dressing. An example of polo mint would be, I'm glad it's payday tomorrow, I've been totally polo all month. Q is for Quaker oat, which means coat. There's a few ways of saying coat in Cockney Rhyming Slang. Other examples are weasel and stoat and billy goat. An example of Quaker oat would be, it's a bit chilly outside, make sure you stick your Quaker on. R is for rabbit and pork, which means talk. This phrase was made famous by Cockney duo Chaz and Dave in their 1980 hit Rabbit. Have a listen. Rabbit, 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 rabbit. Well, we get the idea. A variation of rabbit and pork is bunny, which specifically refers to someone who has far too much to say for themselves. As in, you've got way too much bunny, pal. An example of rabbit and pork could be, I hope I'm not in trouble. The boss just said he wants to see me upstairs now for a serious rabbit. S is for Sweeney Todd, which means flying squad. The flying squad are a unit of specialist officers within the Metropolitan Police. They're tasked with apprehending some of London's most dangerous criminals, primarily armed robbers. The flying squad were formed in the aftermath of World War I, and as such they've been around for over 100 years now. This illustration shows them in action in 1929. The Cockney Rhyming Slang which refers to this elite branch takes its name from one of London's most gruesome legends, that of Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, who was said to murder his customers with a quick slash to the throat as they sat in his chair. In the 1970s, the Cockney phrase Sweeney Todd was made famous when it lent itself to a gritty cop drama all about the flying squad's exploits. Unless you're some sort of Cockney villain, there isn't really much use for the phrase Sweeney Todd. I suppose one example could be, where's the getaway car? The Sweeney are going to be any minute. T is for taters in the mould, which means cold. In case you're wondering, taters is Cockney shorthand for potatoes, so this phrase is essentially referring to mouldy old spuds. An example of its use could be, oh, blimey, it's a bit taters in here, isn't it? It frees my backside off. U is for Uncle Bert, which means shirt. Uncle is used quite a lot in rhyming slang. Other examples include Uncle Fred, which means bread, and Uncle Ned, which means bed. Aunties are employed too. For example, Auntie Ella means umbrella, and Auntie Nellie means belly. Anyway, returning to Uncle Bert, an example would be, I love your Uncle Bert, very stylish. V is for Vincent Price, which means ice. As I'm sure you've already guessed, this rhyming slang is inspired by the famous American actor Vincent Price, who began working in the 1930s and went on to become associated with the horror genre. Another term which begins with V and is inspired by a celebrity is virulin, which means gin. These two terms are therefore well paired. You could say, I'll have a double beer and tonic with a couple of drops of Vincent Price, please. W is for whistle and flute, which means suit. This is one of the most famous examples of Cockney rhyming slang. An example of its use would be, I always get my whistles from Savile Row. Okay, as far as I'm aware, there are no official Cockney rhyming slang terms that begin with X. However, I didn't want to leave the letter out, so the following term, and I really must emphasise this for those Cockney rhyming slang purists out there, is one of my own devising, and an example which I hope you'll agree is well suited to the modern world. So, X is for xylophone, which means drone. An example of its use could be, check out the cracking footage of London which this xylophone managed to capture. Y is for Yarmouth bloater, which means motor, as in motor car. There's a few ways of saying car in Cockney rhyming slang. You can also say haddock and bloater, or jam jar, or near and far. As for Yarmouth bloater, an example of its use could be, sorry I'm late, the old Yarmouth broke down again. As with X, I'm not really sure of any classic Cockney rhyming slang terms that begin with Z. So, as with xylophone, this one is of my own making, and it's one which I hope reflects the modern world. Z, therefore, is for zombie grown, which means mobile phone. The traditional way to say telephone in Cockney rhyming slang is to use the very famous phrase dog and bone. However, that seems to refer to the very old-fashioned telephones, and in the 21st century, of course, everyone is glued to their mobiles. Rather like a zombie, in fact, so there you go. You could maybe use zombie groan like this. Sorry, I can't talk for much longer. I've used up all the 3 minutes on me zombie. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this journey through London's Cockney rhyming slang. What are your favourite examples of this funny old dialect? Let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider subscribing to this channel. This will help it grow, and it will also ensure that you don't miss out on any future content. Likes and shares are also very welcome. If in the meantime you're after more London history and trivia, you can also head on over to my website, robslondon.com, or if you're after a special gift, why not check out my Etsy store, Rob's Online Designs, where you'll find an array of merchandise, including these Cockney rhyming slang themed mugs. Links are all in the description. In the meantime, thanks again and stay well.